They want to hide their secrets, and I just love digging away to find out what they don't want us to know.
The moment that shit had been ordinary turned into a quiet storm that almost shattered a royal family from the inside. A child disappears for just a few hours, but the truth, it doesn't behave like an accident. It breathes like a plan. And the deeper you look, the more it stops feeling like panic and starts feeling like precision. Because what if this wasn't about losing a child, but about planting something far more dangerous inside him? It started so simply, it almost feels insulting. A normal school morning, the kind that disappears into routine. A young boy smiling, stepping into a car, carrying nothing but innocence. No warning, no chaos, just quiet obedience. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because when something is planned perfectly, it doesn't look like a crime. It looks like permission, a neatly printed form, a familiar driver, a trusted face. Everything checked, everything approved, everything believable. Too believable. But here's where the air begins to shift, because trust in this story is not protection, it's the weapon. Inside the palace, nothing seemed wrong until one phone call cracked the illusion open. A simple question: has he been picked up? That's all it took. And suddenly, reality collapsed. No request, no driver assigned, no plan, just absence. And absence inside a royal household doesn't stay quiet. It echoes, it spreads, it infects everything. And in that moment, something terrifying happens. Not panic, not yet. Something colder, realization. The kind that doesn't scream, it tightens your chest and refuses to let go. Doors open too fast. Footsteps sound too loud. Words don't land properly. He's missing, not misplaced, not delayed, missing. And just like that, the controlled world of power and protocol begins to fracture. Because there are rules for everything except this. And then the questions begin. Too many, too fast. Who took him? Why was it allowed? How did no one see it? But the most dangerous question, the one nobody wants to say out loud, was this random or was it personal? Because patterns don't lie. And this didn't feel random. The search moves quickly, almost aggressively. Cameras, logs, calls, movements tracked down to seconds. And yet, there's something off. No chaos, no struggle, no resistance. Just a boy who walked away willingly. That detail doesn't calm anything, it makes it worse. Because children don't just leave unless they believe they should. And belief can be manufactured. 2 hours. That's all it took for him to return. 2 hours to disappear. 2 hours to come back, and yet somehow everything had changed. He walks in, shoulders lower than they should be. Eyes avoiding contact. Words too simple to be true. I just went to play. It sounds harmless, it sounds small, but it doesn't sound real because fear doesn't disappear in 2 hours. It hides. And when it hides, it leaks through silence. Watch closely. Not what he says, but what he doesn't. The hesitation, the trembling hands, the forced calm. This is not a child who broke rules. This is a child who is carrying something he doesn't understand, but knows is dangerous. And that's when suspicion stops being optional and becomes unavoidable. Night falls, but no one rests. Because something is sitting in that house, something invisible but heavy. And it's not the disappearance, it's what happened during those missing hours, what was said, what was planted, what was left behind inside that boy's mind. And then the smallest object changes everything. A notebook, worn, forgotten, harmless at first glance, but the truth rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, quietly, in handwriting that shouldn't carry fear, but does. And when those words are read, the entire story shifts. A woman. A badge, a familiar driver, a voice that didn't sound dangerous until it was. Not threats, not force, something far more precise. Words designed to cut deeper than fear. Words that don't hurt the body, they reshape the mind. You're not important. That sentence doesn't belong in a random incident. That sentence belongs in intention. Because think about it. Whoever did this didn't want the child. They wanted the doubt. They wanted the fracture. They wanted something that doesn't heal quickly. Insecurity. And suddenly, the disappearance stops looking like a mistake and starts looking like a message. Now ask yourself this: who benefits from that message? Who gains from planting doubt inside a child about his place in his own family? That's not random chaos, that's targeted, personal, strategic. And when a symbol appears, a small detail, almost easy to ignore, but repeated, recognized, remembered, everything begins pointing somewhere very specific, somewhere far, but not disconnected, because distance doesn't erase influence. Sometimes it hides it better. Now the tension changes shape. It's no longer what happened. It becomes who wanted this to happen. And that's when things get dangerous, because the answer doesn't lead outside the circle, it leads back inside it. Old tensions, unspoken conflicts, quiet rivalries that never truly disappeared just went silent. And silence in stories like this is never empty. It's loaded. And suddenly, the possibility becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't about taking a child, it was about sending a signal, a psychological strike, subtle enough to deny, powerful enough to damage. Because if you can make a child question his place, you don't need to attack the family directly. You weaken it from within. And that's exactly what makes this terrifying. No bruises, no evidence of force, just a boy who came back different. And the worst part, that kind of damage doesn't show immediately. It grows quietly, patiently, until one day it becomes something bigger than the moment it started. So now the investigation isn't chasing a missing child anymore. It's chasing intention. And intentions don't leave clean trails. They leave fragments, clues, patterns, small contradictions that don't make sense alone, but when you connect them, they form something much darker. And as those pieces begin to align, one name starts to emerge from the shadows. Not loudly, not officially, but unmistakably. And once that name enters the conversation, everything changes. Because now, this is no longer an incident. It's a confrontation waiting to happen. And just when it seemed like the truth was hovering dangerously close to the surface, it slipped deeper, almost like it knew it was being hunted. Because what came next wasn't chaos, it was confirmation, quiet, calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in that palace was prepared to accept. The investigation didn't explode outward, it narrowed inward. Every clue was treated like a thread, and every thread led back to something that didn't sit right. Flight records weren't supposed to matter at first, but they did. A private arrival, a familiar name, a timeline that aligned too perfectly with the hours that had gone missing. It wasn't coincidence anymore, it was presence. And presence changes everything. Because once someone is physically there, the distance excuse collapses instantly. Now the silence around the situation became louder than any accusation. Why was she there? Why quietly? Why at that exact moment? No public appearance, no official reason, just a quiet arrival followed by a child's disappearance. That's not a gap, that's a connection. But here's where it gets sharper, because one detail doesn't just support suspicion, it amplifies it. The driver, the one person who turned trust into access, the one face the child recognized without hesitation. And then, suddenly, he vanishes from the system too. A resignation that arrives too fast, too clean, too convenient. Coincidence or cleanup? Because when someone disappears right after a critical moment, they're not escaping, they're being erased from the narrative. But this time, the narrative didn't let go. The pressure tightened quietly. No public exposure, no loud confrontation, just controlled pursuit. And eventually, the cracks began to show. Because truth doesn't like pressure, it leaks under it. When the driver finally broke, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no resistance, just a slow collapse into reality. Money, instructions, a plan that was never meant to leave marks, only effects. He wasn't the mastermind, he was the bridge. And bridges don't create destinations, they connect them. And now the destination was clear. But here's the twist that makes this story darker than it looks. Even with confession, even with patterns aligning, even with evidence stacking, it still wasn't enough. Because whoever was behind this didn't operate carelessly. Every move was layered with denial. Every action designed to look harmless if exposed. This wasn't just manipulation. This was calculated deniability. So instead of reacting, they waited. And waiting in situations like this is not weakness. It's strategy. The trap wasn't set loudly. It was subtle, invisible, a continuation of the same illusion that started everything. Because if someone believes they're still in control, they make mistakes. And mistakes are louder than confessions. Because confidence only exists when risk feels distant. The moment risk becomes real, it cracks. Inside that private room, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but visibly. Because when someone realizes the narrative they built is collapsing, their composure doesn't disappear, it tightens. And that tightening reveals everything. Denial comes first. It always does. But denial, when faced with layered evidence, doesn't hold. It weakens. It hesitates. It starts sounding less like truth and more like defense. And eventually, silence takes over. Not because there's nothing to say, but because there's nothing left that can be said without confirming everything. Back at the palace, the atmosphere wasn't victorious. It wasn't relieved. It was heavy. Because uncovering truth doesn't always bring closure, sometimes it deepens the damage. The recordings played again. The words echoed again. And this time, they weren't just clues. They were confirmation of something much worse than a single act. Intent. Because intention defines everything. And the intention here wasn't protection. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was influence, driven by something deeper, something personal, something strategic. And when motive surfaces, everything becomes clearer and darker at the same time. This wasn't just about a child. This was about leverage, about timing, about pressure before something bigger, something that required advantage. And suddenly, the entire situation expands beyond the moment. It connects to decisions, to positions, to control within a system that thrives on balance. Because destabilize one part and the rest begins to shift. The decision to keep it internal wasn't weakness. It was containment. Because exposure doesn't just reveal truth, it creates consequences that ripple outward. And in environments built on image, those ripples can become storms. So the consequence came quietly. Restrictions, distance, control tightened in ways the public would never fully see. But internally, the fracture was complete. And fractures like that don't heal easily because trust, once broken at that level, doesn't rebuild the same way. The silence between individuals becomes louder. Conversations become shorter. Distance becomes permanent. And somewhere in all of that, a child sits quietly, still processing something he was never meant to carry. Because here's the truth no one says out loud. The investigation may have ended, but the effect didn't. That single idea planted in his mind doesn't disappear overnight. It lingers, it questions, it returns in quiet moments. And that's the real cost. Not the incident, not the exposure, but the invisible damage that continues long after everything appears calm. And as night falls again over that same city, nothing looks different from the outside. Lights glow. Movement continues. Life appears normal. But inside, something has shifted permanently. Because once a line like this is crossed, it doesn't uncross. And the most unsettling part, this story didn't end with confrontation. It ended with distance, with silence, with the quiet understanding that the danger didn't come from outside the walls, it came from within reach. And if it happened once, who's to say it can't happen again?